that is one of the things about Catherine de Medici. She has just a terrible, terrible reputation. She's known as the Serpent Queen. She's also been called the Black Queen. Now, why does she have such a terrible reputation?
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine.
Catherine de Medici has gone down in history as the sinister Serpent Queen, who supposedly had a flying squadron of female spies in her court, and may have instigated the deadly St Bartholomew's Day massacre. But is this a fair judgment of the 16th century Queen Consort and Regent? I spoke to historian Leah Redmond Chang to reassess Catherine's twisted reputation and shine a light on her struggles and achievements as one of the era's most powerful people.
Today we are going to be delving into the life of Catherine de Medici. So who was she? Can you give us a 60-second bio?
Sure. Catherine de Medici was a 16th century queen consort. She was also a queen mother. And for a little while, she was the queen regent of France. And I would say that she was arguably one of the most powerful people in the second half of the 16th century, and perhaps the most powerful woman, even rivaling the power of Elizabeth Tudor.
Now, that is quite a statement to make about her. Along with this grand reputation that you've just given her, she's also been called the Serpent Queen. I think we need to address this up front. Why has she got such a rotten legacy?
Yeah, that is one of the things about Catherine de Medici. She has just a terrible, terrible reputation. As you say, she's known as the Serpent Queen. She's also been called the Black Queen, which has a double meaning. It's partially because she used to dress all in black, but also because she had sort of a nefarious reputation, and that word was used to kind of, hint at this. She's also called the Italian Queen, which is playing up on the idea that somehow she was always a foreigner, an interloper at the French court. Now, why does she have such a terrible reputation? That is actually a very complicated question. One thing I would say is that she lived in the second half of the 16th century. It was a very fraught time in France because of religious differences, religious wars that were going on in France. So Catherine had a lot of enemies. She had a lot of supporters, but she also had a lot of enemies. And that's when this reputation begins. And it just carries over into the ensuing centuries. She was really a political animal, and our culture doesn't receive those types of women very well. So that is why this reputation, this terrible reputation, has endured.
No, I think that's a really interesting point to start with, because we're going to be following this legacy as we talk about her life. But first, can we go right back to the start? Can you tell us about Catherine's early life?
So she's a Medici, and she's born in Florence in 1519. She is the only child of Lorenzo de Medici, who at that time was the head of the senior branch of the Medici family, although quite a young man, and his wife, who was actually a French princess, and her name was Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne. But both parents die within weeks of her birth. So from the time she is basically a newborn, Catherine is an orphan. Now, one thing I do want to say here is that, as I mentioned before, Catherine is known as the Italian Queen. And what a lot of people don't realize is that she actually was connected to the French nobility through her mother. Her mother was a very highborn French aristocrat, quite close to the royal family. So, this sort of French-Italian hybrid identity is something that Catherine knows about herself from the time she is an early child. But to go back to the narrative, she's the only child of, this senior line of the Medici. So she's a bit of a placeholder. The Medici really do see her as the one who's kind of going to hold their position as the rulers of Florence. But of course, again, she's a baby and she's a girl. And so this was a bit of a disappointment to the Medici. The thing about girls, historically, is that most children are very difficult to track in the archives. There was always the risk that they were going to die, before they were 10 years old. So people didn't really pay too much attention to them. But for girls in particular, they're not considered to be particularly politically relevant, except perhaps as marriage pawns. And that is how everyone saw Catherine. But then something happens when she's about 8 years old. The Medici are thrust out by rebellious Florentines, and Catherine is taken hostage, and she's put in a convent for 3 years. And it's an extremely trying time for her. At some point, she really thought her life was going to be threatened. She does come out of that eventually safe, but it was quite an education for her as a child. And maybe that is where Catherine first learns to be politically savvy and resilient. It was during this very tumultuous childhood.
Talking about her personality here, obviously she's gained this really vile reputation in her later life. Can you tell us actually what Catherine was like as a person?
Sure. Now, I do want to say that the vile reputation, it does come from somewhere. It's not that, she was a, wholly innocent or sweet person, who has somehow been completely dragged through the coals. But I do think what happens is that we tend to kind of, play up certain qualities in all historical people, right? We could sort of pick and choose the ones that we want to focus on. So, as a person, I would say this. Catherine showed those street smarts very, very young. I think, from the beginning, that was going to earn her friends, but also potentially earn her enemies. She also, I think, was quite glib. She knew how to use her words well. And because of that, when she comes to the French court at the age of 14, she very quickly makes friends with her father-in-law, the French king, Francis I, and with his very powerful sister, Marguerite de Navarre. Now, part of that is because Catherine is charming. She's very intelligent, and she also loved art, genuinely so, and, was willing to talk about that. But that ability to make friends was also just a wee bit calculated, I would say. That is part of Catherine's survival strategy. But I would say that Catherine shares that ability and those strategies with everybody else who is successful at court at the time. So it's a little bit unfair to single her out for those abilities. She's just doing what everyone else is doing. But I would say that, Catherine is no wallflower. She is an extrovert. She's an extrovert. She likes people. She's a great communicator. She's a presence at court. But, where she shows a lot of skill is knowing when to step into the spotlight, but also perhaps knowing when to step out of it a little bit.
From the French court, how did Catherine go on to become queen?
Yes. So, originally she's married at the age of 14 to a French prince, Henry, Duke of Orleans, who at the time, he was 14 years old too. And at the time, he is not yet the heir to the French throne. But about 3 years into the marriage, Henry's older brother dies, and then Henry becomes the heir, which is a little bit tense, I will say, because Henry was not the favorite son of the French king, Francis I. So at that point, a very sort of blinding spotlight shines down on Henry and on his wife, Catherine. Eventually, Francis dies, and that is when Henry accedes to the throne, and Catherine becomes the queen consort, and that is in 1547.
What do we know about their relationship?
So the relationship between Henry and Francis was not very good, but also the relationship between Henry and his wife, Catherine, was a little bit tense. Now, the first thing I want to say is that marriages in the 16th century, particularly among royal people, are very different than marriages today. Francis I had several lovers, so many, and his mistresses were so important to him that he made the royal mistress, an official position at the French court. Yes, she was called the maîtresse en titre, the titled mistress, and this woman, whoever she might be, had a lot of power at court. So Henry also had a mistress, and her name was Diane de Poitiers, or Diane de Poitiers. She was something of a mother figure to Henry, Catherine's husband, because his own mother had died when he was very young, just a child. And her relationship with Henry starts out in this very maternal way, but by the time he's a teenager, they're clearly sleeping together. And it's a really interesting relationship because Diane is 20 years older than him. So by the time that Catherine comes to the French court, Diane is already on the scene. She already has Henry wrapped around her little finger. And this is what I meant by Catherine understanding that sometimes you have to step out of the spotlight. I learned pretty quickly that, Diane was always going to be the first woman in Henry's eyes. Catherine did not like this. It was a very imbalanced relationship because Henry treated her respectfully, apart from the question of the mistress. But Catherine seems to really have been in love with Henry. And, I've asked myself frequently, why is it that she fell so in love with him? Everyone at the time understood what these marriages were about, that they were political arrangements. But I sometimes wonder if Catherine's status as an orphan, someone who grew up, sort of with no fixed place in her own family, was eager to kind of, find that secure place in her marriage in France. And, from the beginning, it must have come as a shock to realize that she was never really going to be the first lady, either in the marriage or at the French court, as long as Diane was going to be around. And, Diane wielded all sorts of power. Not only did she wield political power, especially when Henry becomes king, but she also she's very involved in their marriage. She's very involved in the raising of the royal children. It's like a threesome. And in fact, Henry's famous royal initials are an H intertwined with a C. But a number of contemporaries at the time and scholars since have thought that that's actually what we're actually seeing in those initials is an H intertwined with both a C and a D.
What a scandal. I guess the other part here that we should probably talk about is, of course, Catherine had her own struggles as well, with her own fertility very early on in her relationship. Could you touch on that at all?
Absolutely. Yes, this is Catherine's number one struggle as a young future queen. She was not yet the queen consort yet, but Henry was, slated to become king. And so there was enormous pressure on Catherine to produce a child because any woman in her position has to show that she's going to be able to continue the dynasty. That is the queen's role. And the risk there is that if a young woman in her position can't have those children, there's always the threat that she could be repudiated, that the marriage could be ended, and that, she would have to be sent back to wherever she came from. And in Catherine's case, that would have been back to Italy. So Catherine is married at the age of 14, and she struggles to even conceive for 10 years. And in the first few years, no one paid that much mind. She was young. No one was really sure if they were even sleeping together so much. People were patient. But once Henry became the heir, there was a lot of pressure. And then the pressure got even worse because at some point, Henry actually fathers an illegitimate child. So when that happens, the fault seems to shift, onto Catherine. the fact that that royal couple has not had a child seems to be mostly Catherine's fault. So she tried everything. She prayed, she took various different potions, and this is where Diane got involved. Diane actually was, quite helpful to Catherine as Catherine was trying to conceive. She also sent her medicines, and Diane hired doctors to examine both, Henry and Catherine to see what might be the trouble. And eventually Diane sends Henry to sleep with Catherine more often because Diane guessed that maybe the problem was that they just weren't trying hard enough. The irony is that in the end, the fault did seem to lie with Henry rather than Catherine. The doctor figured this out. He recommended certain positions to help alleviate this problem. Unfortunately, his notes have been lost, so we have no inkling about what those were. But that seemed to have done the trick. And after 10 years, Catherine finally conceives, and then she gives birth to a baby boy. So she wins. In the end, she wins. She gives birth not only to a baby, but to a boy who will, of course, become the heir. And then she goes on to become fabulously fertile. She gives birth to 10 children in rapid succession. So it's a complete reversal of fortune.
Now, this really brings us on to the next stage in Catherine's life. As we've been speaking about her children, she then goes on to become regent or advisor to her sons when they become king. So moving into this era, how exactly does she come into power here? And were there perhaps any people vying for this role too?
Yes. And, to understand this situation, which happens in 1559, I have to give you a lot of background, or, at least a little bit, on the religious situation in France at the time. So the 16th century is the age of Reformation. That's when Protestantism really develops. The reason why the Reformation is so problematic is that it is threatening to break up the nobility. The nobility is no longer unified because of the religious question. And that, definitely causes a lot of instability in the country. The Catholic monarchs are also very concerned that as more nobles convert to Protestantism, there will be more risk of sedition. Tensions are riding really high. And for Catherine's husband, Henry, this is really an important question because he is a very staunch Catholic. And he's really eager to get rid of Protestantism. And in fact, at one point towards the end of his life, there is some question about whether or not he should introduce something that was like the Spanish Inquisition in France. And I think had he lived, it might have gone in that direction. However, he doesn't live. What happens is in 1559, during the celebrations for the wedding of his oldest daughter, Henry is killed. He's mortally wounded in a terrible freak jousting accident, and he dies 10 days later. The throne at that point passes to his teenage son, Francis, who's only 15. He's married to Mary, Queen of Scots, who is 16 years old at the time. And no one had expected something like this to happen. At the time of his death, he was only 40 years old. So because of this, no one had really adequately prepared the new young king, Francis, at 15, to take the throne. He's too old for a regent at that time, but he's clearly going to need some sort of help. So the people who step in are the Guise brothers. Now, the Guise brothers are the uncles of the new king's wife, Mary, Queen of Scots. They're very powerful. They're also staunchly Catholic. But the other person who steps in here in a kind of advisory role is Catherine, Francis's mother. Unfortunately, Francis doesn't last long on the throne. He dies 18 months after taking it. And it is at that point that Catherine becomes the regent. The next king in line is, in fact, a real child. He's 10-year-old Charles, and he is definitely going to need a regent. It wasn't clear whether or not Catherine was going to have the goodwill of the rest of the French nobility to be regent. The French don't like the idea of women in power. There's no such thing as a French ruling queen. It was almost a law that a woman couldn't take the throne and reign as a sovereign monarch. So the idea of a woman in power as a regent was pretty unpopular. The problem was there was no obvious man who could become regent because the ones who were possible were divided between Catholics and Protestants. The Catholics did not want a Protestant to become regent, a Protestant nobleman, and the Protestants did not want a Catholic nobleman to become regent. So that's when Catherine steps in and basically makes the case that she's the best person to take the regency. And to some degree, for lack of a better choice, everyone agrees that she should be it.
So as advisor to her sons, what powers did she actually have, and how did she maintain this power?
As Queen Mother, she will see the reigns of 3 sons. I mean, in some ways, it's actually tragic because her sons die. You know, there is this kind of view of Catherine that started at the end of the 16th century and continued on, frankly, it still continues today, that from the outset, she was power hungry, that she always wanted to wield, a certain level of power. Just not so sure that that was true, She expected and certainly hoped that her 15-year-old son was going to grow up. She had heard prognostications and predictions that he was going to die young, but we don't know how much she believed those. But then, unfortunately, he did die young. The real power during the reign of Francis II, the teenager, was exercised by the Guise brothers. They were the ones who really held, they were making all the decisions. So, all the signatures on the papers were Francis II's, but it was the Guises, perhaps with, Catherine's help, who were making those decisions. And to some degree, I think we have to ask if whether or not the Guises used Catherine, pushed her to take a more public role as a kind of advisor to her son, because they knew that that was going to be more acceptable. With Charles, it was different. By the time her son Charles, 10 years old, takes the throne, she thinks the Guises have made a mess of things. She wants to take control. She was also very worried about what the Guise brothers would do to her 10-year-old son. She really thought that maybe they were going to use him and take advantage of him. And she had seen the kind of stress that her older son had undergone during his reign. She didn't want that for Charles. So when she is acting effectively as regent, she might as well have been wearing that crown herself. She is exercising all the powers, that a reigning monarch would have. He attains his majority at the age of 13, but as you can imagine, a 13-year-old is not really old enough to rule a country, a kingdom by himself. So she still retains all of those powers. The reason why she wanted her son to declare his majority is because, people are a little uncomfortable with this idea of her as a regent. They'd rather have the king seem to be taking the upper hand. Eventually, her next son, who would become Henry III, he's an adult, but Catherine retains all those powers. But as I've alluded to before, it wasn't easy for her to maintain those powers. She was challenged, certainly early on in her time as a governor. She had cut a certain number of deals with the Guises and with a Protestant nobleman named Antoine de Bourbon, who in some ways really should have been regent. She had cut deals with them so that she could step into power. But the nobility in general didn't really love this idea. What they really wanted her to do, and she writes about this in a letter to her daughter, in fact, what they really wanted her to do was to go home and take care of the children. But she pushed back. One of the things that Catherine is very good at is marketing herself, for lack of a better term. and for creating a narrative to justify her power. She begins to do this the moment she takes the reins with her 10-year-old son, Charles IX. And she continues to do this throughout, really, until the day of her death, through paintings, through spectacles or performances, any book that is dedicated to her. You can see in the dedications a lot of playing up of her value to the kingdom as a queen mother. These are all forms of propaganda. And, Catherine very much had control of how, her image was going to be crafted. Some of that you see in the very fact that she decides to wear black. She put on black from basically the moment that her husband dies, and she wears black for the rest of her life. She is projecting an image that's not just because she was in mourning. She was in mourning. But what she's trying to project is this idea that she is this dedicated widow, dedicated to the legacy of her husband, and she is a devoted mother to her children. Again, this is a way of justifying her place next to the king, her sons. And it was a very, very effective. I mean, she starts showing up everywhere, wearing all that black, and eventually people just kind of get used to her. And they start to think that, yes, this is the way it is. The queen mother is there next to the king. That is the way this court, this kingdom functions.
As well as being master of PR, I guess we could call her, I feel like I've heard before that she was a real keen patron of the arts, and that perhaps her courtly festivities may have had another angle to them. Can you tell us a little bit about Catherine's so-called flying squadron?
Catherine's enemies were very determined to paint her rule and her court as a hotbed of sin. That is really coming from the Protestants, right, who disagree with a number of her policies. Eventually, it actually gets picked up by moderate Catholics, too. So one of the things you have to know about Catherine de Medici and her policies is that for most of her reign as queen consort and queen mother and advisor, she is dedicated to policies of toleration between Catholics and Protestants. She does not want war. She wants them all to find a way to get along. So she consistently goes for the middle ground. The problem is that when any society is deeply polarized and factionalized, the middle ground is often the most unpopular stance that you can take. And that's exactly what happened to Catherine. The Protestants come to detest her, and so do moderate Catholics, and even actually some extreme Catholics who really just want her to choose a side. So all these people eventually start to embrace this idea that she has a very licentious court. And, this idea of the flying squadrons is the idea that Catherine had all of these immoral young women around her who she was deploying as spies everywhere. Now, Catherine did have spies. Make no mistake. She did have spies. But it's unclear that these spies were these immoral women that she had around her. You also asked a little bit earlier about, her as patron of the arts and as these spectacles. Yes, I mean, she loved a party. Catherine loved a party. She also understands the power of spectacles, that if you dazzle people enough, they're going to be impressed and hopefully, fall into line. So that's how she used these spectacles. But again, her enemies could look at these things and talk about how extravagant she was. That she was sort of this freewheeling spender, had no control of her accounts and who was only after a good time. So, she was a little bit, in a tight spot where the strategies that she knew were often politically effective, even in the realm of arts or in theater, were also going to come back, perhaps, and, provide the basis for criticism.
We've been talking a bit about Catherine's popularity with the people, But what do we know about her relationship with her sons? Was she well loved by them? Did they have a good relationship?
In many ways, Catherine was a very good mother. She's often, criticized as being a very bad mother. Even during her lifetime, there were accusations that she spoiled her children. And, when people talked about spoiling her children, they really meant her sons. That's who people chiefly cared about. Obviously, her son Francis, the first teenaged king, he was a very needy child, and he really needed her, right by him. I think that, Charles also was very respectful of his mother. There is some question about whether, around 1570, Charles is still a young man, quite young, in his early 20s, but he is technically a man. If there was some sort of rift between them that started to grow, and you can imagine how that would happen. Like, he would want to come out from under his mother's shadow. But some scholars wonder whether or not that so-called rift was actually a political strategy. If they would sometimes sort of play up disagreements in order to, appease both Catholics or, Protestants. So maybe, Catherine would take the Catholic side and Charles would take the Protestant side. And so they would seem to differ, but what they were actually doing was working in tandem to try to kind of keep everybody happy. It's a theory that's out there. Catherine's favorite son was Henry III, her third son to reach adulthood, to reach the throne of France. And he was her favorite from the time he was an infant. I think that they were the most alike in some ways. Henry was a very cultivated, extremely sophisticated person, also extremely athletic. He was sort of everything, So in some ways, the son who she thought and hoped was going to be the future of the dynasty. But I think the other reason why she loved Henry is because she became pregnant with him just after another little son, whose name was Louis, died as a toddler. He died of the measles, and she felt that loss so deeply. He was the first of her children to die. She lost 3 when they were infants or toddlers. He was the first one. I just can't even imagine what that must have felt like. And when Henry was born, she would never travel far from where he was. And I just see there a kind of deep emotional need to attach to that new baby. So I wonder if that's one of the reasons why Henry would always become her favorite, or was destined to be her favorite. And he was her favorite. At the end of her life, things in France were just horrible. There had been 8 civil wars around the question of religion. Henry's reign, had been considerably weakened, and Catherine really feared for him. And I think that this is all to say that I think that things had gotten a little bit tense between them because she didn't think that Henry was making the right decisions. And at the same time, I think he had grown quite frustrated with her resistance to his decisions. And also as, a man trying to kind of come into his own, he was frustrated by having his mother, always there. And in fact, sort of one of the things at the end of her life, which, some people say helped send her to her grave, was that Henry ordered a certain political assassination that she thought was a terrible idea. And she herself said that she was heartbroken that he had done this. And a few days later, she died.
As we're coming to the end of Catherine's life, I think there's something that we can't possibly finish this episode without, and that's the St Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And obviously we've spoken a little bit about the religious, the political tensions in France at this time, and also about the idea that maybe mother and son played off each other to create a bit of good PR. But when it comes to the St Bartholomew's Day Massacre, Catherine is put first and foremost as the instigator of this horrendous event. What do you think about this? Is it a myth? Is it true?
Well, first, we will never have the answers to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre because there are no easy answers, and the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. So just to explain, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre happens in August of 1572, and it's just following the wedding of Catherine's youngest daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to Henry of Bourbon, a young man, but who is the chief of the Protestants at the time. Just days after the wedding, one of the chiefs of the Protestants, a man who was known as the Admiral Coligny, is mortally injured in what appeared to be an assassination attempt. And then just days after that, the Guises, these are different Guises than the one I alluded to before. This is the next generation. But the third Duke of Guise and his cronies burst into the chambers where the Admiral Coligny is recovering, and they brutally murder him and throw him out of the window, decapitate him, and drag him through the streets of Paris. Something about this triggers a kind of mob reaction in Paris. Now, what you have to understand is that at the time, Paris is fervently Catholic, and Parisians were known to be just very opinionated and very hot-headed. And tensions had been running high because of this wedding for weeks, creating this fever pitch in the city. So after this assassination happens, something was triggered. The tocsin in the city, in one of the churches, starts to ring, and this massacre starts to unfold. Catholics kill Protestants. They also kill all sorts of people in this massacre, but they are specifically targeting Protestants in the streets, in their homes, at night while they're sleeping. This goes on for several days. And in the end, thousands and thousands of Protestants are murdered. The numbers are a little bit unclear. Scholars think that probably upwards of 3,000 Protestants were killed in Paris alone. And then, one of the really horrendous things is that this news of this massacre starts to spread, and then similar massacres start to occur all over France. So, in the end, we don't know for sure exactly what the death toll is, but some people speculate that it is in the tens of thousands. So the real question is, did Catherine know what was going to happen? She is consistently blamed for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in a very sort of neat and pat way. If you read textbooks that talk about the 16th century, they will often put in the context, just because it's easier to say, that Catherine de Medici orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, or that she ordered it. And that is how this legend has come down to us all the way through to today. And I think on some level, we're never going to be able to undo it. Some people think that that is just in some ways just libel, that she had no knowledge of this whatsoever. And, I understand that point of view, because Catherine had spent an entire lifetime, a career, trying to make peace between Catholics and Protestants. So to some degree, it just seems like a complete about-face that she would turn around and order the brutal massacre of Protestants, to eliminate them entirely. Other scholars think that maybe what happened was that there had been an order to eliminate the leadership of the Protestants, maybe a dozen noblemen, and that what happened is it just got out of control. And then there's a third theory. The third theory is that the real target was this Admiral Coligny, and that, again, once he was murdered, the fever pitch of the Parisians, of the Catholic Parisians, just took over. And suddenly you had mob rule and no one could get control of it. To some degree, I really think that it's the real answer is probably somewhere between the idea that the Protestant leadership was targeted or that only Coligny was targeted. Catherine, as one scholar has said, was no saint. She was not above political assassination. And if she really felt that, these noblemen or that one nobleman, Coligny, was somehow in the way, maybe she would have decided to eliminate them. But I do think that what really happened is the mob took over. And then, it escalated so quickly and so horrendously that the crown just had no power to really, restore order. If I can say, though, I do think, when we talk about her notorious legacy today, it is because of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Earlier, I said that Catherine was a master, propagandist. She was a great storyteller, but she was never able to get control of the story of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And to her detriment, she was not able to sort of issue a narrative that somehow reintegrated it with the policies of mediation and toleration that she always claimed to be, trying to uphold.
I think this is a really good point for us to move into talk about legacy. But before we do, I've got one question beforehand, and that's basically, how and when did Catherine die?
She dies in 1589, so she was 69 years old, which at the time was quite old. And she had worked basically until her, practically her last days. Even though she was quite ill for the last several months of her life, when they did the autopsy, she had some blood in her brain, and I think she had an abscess, somewhere in her abdomen or, perhaps near her lungs. I think the idea is that she probably died of some sort of pleurisy. But, the other thing that no doubt killed her was stress, because she could see that her son, Henry III, was about to lose his throne. So everything that she feared, did come to pass. So a combination of illness and stress is probably what brought about her death. And I can imagine that to some degree she must have died feeling like in some ways she had failed, in safeguarding the kingdom for her sons, which is what she had set out to do when she first, started to rule as Queen Mother.
That very neatly brings us on to talking about this legacy. What do you think were perhaps her most significant achievements? I think you may have answered the failings there, but what about her failings too?
Well, in some ways her failing is also her strength. When she dies, France has sort of descended into this morass. But the truth of the matter is that there were several points along the way when France seemed to be falling apart or almost falling apart, and Catherine would manage to keep it together. She reigned in her capacity as Queen Mother. She reigned for, almost 30 years. And she managed to steer the kingdom through several civil wars. Now, were these civil wars inevitable? Perhaps one of her failings is that she couldn't avoid them. But perhaps one of her successes is the fact that she managed to bring France out of these civil wars and to keep it together, to keep her sons on that throne for the next 30 years until eventually Henry III dies, and then the dynasty does pass to the Bourbons. But that was a skill. There's an Italian ambassador towards the end of her life who does say that no one could have steered France through this political and religious situation well. There's no way that the monarchy was going to come out unscathed from this. And he says this in order to give Catherine credit, that people shouldn't criticize, because in fact, she was doing as good a job as anyone else could have done, or perhaps even better. So I do think in some ways the success and the failure are interwoven. interwoven together. And the other thing that I would say is that to be a woman in power at this time was no easy feat. No one liked women in power, particularly in France when women aren't supposed to be ruling. But even in other countries where women could take the throne legally, no one really liked a woman in power. Everyone was waiting for them to kind of just go away or marry someone who would take over or have a son. No one liked it. So the fact that Catherine managed to cultivate respect and hold on to that power is a success. And I will say that at her death, even though there were many, many, people who rejoiced at her death, half the kingdom was shattered by it. And, there were reports of at her funeral, the level of kind of devastation that, people seemed to feel, and also despair about, what the kingdom was going to do without her, shows, again, how deeply she had woven herself into France's identity.
Catherine has recently featured on the drama The Serpent Queen. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on this? Do you perhaps have any other favourite surprising or interesting or shocking retellings of Catherine's story?
Yes. So the Serpent Queen premiered in the US, where I am, some time ago. But I will confess, I haven't watched it yet because whenever I'm writing about someone, I try to avoid, any kind of film or TV show about them because I am very impressionable. And if I see or hear something, I am sure that it's going to affect how I'm going to read a source. However, I do know a little bit about the Serpent Queen, and what I know is that it's, first of all, it's a bit tongue in cheek, which I can wholly appreciate, and second of all, that it does show Catherine as this manipulative woman, while at the same time asking the audience to query whether or not that's always such a bad thing, or to ask themselves, what they would do in the same situations that she had found herself. And I love this idea because, my take on Catherine is that she is not, fully a saint, nor is she fully a sinner. Like any human being, she is complex. And we have to take the bad with the good and the good with the bad. And that is what makes her interesting. Plus the fact that, of course, like any human being, she develops as a personality over the course of her life. She might have been one way when she was 14 and an entirely different way when she was 69. And, she is as vulnerable to the effects of power as any other human being, particularly in a kingdom that is beset by war. But the question, what is my favorite kind of iteration of Catherine? Well, I will say, because of the St Bartholomew's Day Massacre onward, she's always used as kind of a bad figure, like an evil figure. So, a very famous portrayal of her is as the evil Italian queen in the movie Queen Margot, which I actually love that movie. It's great. But Catherine is very Italian in that movie and quite evil. But, I've wondered whether or not Catherine wasn't the prototype for the evil queen in Snow White. Because if you were to look at a portrait of Catherine in her all-black garb with her all-black veils, I think you would find a striking resemblance. And even that concept of an evil queen, Catherine didn't originate it, but in the propaganda after she died, into the 17th and 18th centuries onward, she kind of incarnates the idea of the evil queen. So any concept of an evil queen in any kind of Western media or literature is going to, probably touch on some stereotype that is also associated with Catherine.